Good evening. Welcome to our continuing study on 1 Samuel. This originally airs on November 12th, 2020, and our Thursday night online course is keeping pace with our Wednesday night in-person course. And I'll share with you where we're going here in just a bit, but at any time, if you're ready to come back in person, 6:15 on Wednesday nights, I'm teaching this on the fourth floor of our Adult Conference Center in our children's building, where most of our Wednesday night developed classes are. And I will say we're going to continue this study through the Christmas break, and we're going to end up in 1 Samuel chapter 16. And what we're going to do in next semester's course, which begins in January, is we're going to pick up at 1 Samuel 16. But instead of focusing on Samuel, we're going to be focusing on David, and we're going to walk through his life, his early life, very tumultuous time as he was assuming being the second king of Israel. So tonight we're in 1 Samuel chapter 13, and if you remember where we've been up to this point, happy days are here again. Saul, after the people have requested a king, God gives them a ruler, and that ruler had to go through his paces, right, before he could take full control. So he had to be appointed, then anointed, and then he had to prove himself in battle. Now, all that's happened. So in 1 Samuel 13, here's the opening verse. Saul was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned 42 years in Israel. So this one sentence is called a royal resume, and you'll see this in the Kings and the Chronicles, usually before or just after telling a king's story or telling the highlights of his career. There'd be this one sentence summary. Here's how old he was when he assumed power. Here's how long he reigned, and often in the Kings and Chronicles it would say that he was buried. He rested with his fathers and was buried with his fathers. So what we have here is just a little bit of biographical detail that Saul was 30 years old, and this fits with when the people saw how tall he was and his stature. It kind of says, he was in his prime. And says he reigned in Israel for 42 years. Now, there is a textual variant here, which means in all the manuscripts that we have, there seems to be some discrepancies here. And this is one of those times where we don't have the exact, what did the original writer write. But notice that where these textual variants come up, it doesn't affect the theology, it doesn't affect the story, but there are a few gaps that we have because there were no Xerox machines in the early world, right, in the ancient world. Hand copies were made. So one of the variants said that Saul was 30 years old and he reigned in Israel for 2 years instead of 42, which means that the events that we're about to read happens 2 years after what we've just experienced. Now, I don't think that's the case here. I think 42 is probably the best interpretation of that, because if Saul is 30 years old when he becomes king, and he reigns for 2 years, here in just a minute we're going to read about his son Jonathan, and his son Jonathan being given pretty much given the responsibility of a general leading troops. Well, you do the math on that. Saul would have had to have a child when he was 12 years old, which is not impossible, but it's probably not very probable given the culture. So my best understanding of this is probably if we look at the events making Saul king, okay, when he was 30, probably what's happened is another 20 years has passed, maybe 20 years or so, because when we meet him becoming king, he's still working for his dad, chasing down donkeys. But now his situation, he probably was married about the same time he became king, immediately have kids. His oldest son would be Jonathan. So now Jonathan would be 20, which would make Saul about 50. So here we are at about the halfway point of Saul's reign. Maybe he's already been king for 20 years, and now he kind of reaches this plateau in his leadership. And that plateau is when things start to unravel. So let's read this account, and then we'll kind of explain as we go along. So he chose 3,000 men from Israel for himself. 2,000 were with Saul at Michmash and in Bethel's hill country, and 1,000 were with Jonathan. So here's the first time that we hear of Saul's son Jonathan, just kind of unannounced, but here he is. Jonathan in Gibeah of Benjamin. He sent the rest of the troops away to his own tent. So instead of a citizen militia that would be called together whenever there was a time of trouble, now there's a standing army, okay? And that was the people's dream, that they would have a king, a permanent ruler, who would go out and fight our battles for us, meaning that he would have a standing army, he would be in charge, and he would take care of times of crisis. And that's about to happen, okay? So this is a test of Saul's leadership, all right? So this is in verse 3. Jonathan attacked the Philistine garrison that was in Geba. Now, this word garrison, the plural does mean a fortress. The singular for garrison means governor, all right? So probably the best translation in here is that Jonathan attacked the governor at Geba, which means that Jonathan assassinated a Philistine leader. So as we all know, that when you assassinate a leader, that destabilizes the environment. Things kind of start picking up. So that's exactly what happened. Things are destabilized, and the Philistines heard about this. All right, so Saul blew the ram's horn throughout the land. This was a call to arms, right? A call to action. He's pulling together the standing army and others who want to volunteer. And all of Israel heard the news, verse 4. Saul has attacked the Philistine garrison, and Israel is now repulsive to the Philistines. Now, although Jonathan did the work, he was operating under the commands of Saul. So, Jonathan actually killed the governor. But Saul seems to be the one that gave the command, okay? Then the troops were summoned to join Saul at Gilgal. Now, what happens next, this next paragraph, this is what I find to be very interesting from a historical standpoint. The Philistines also gathered to fight against Israel. 3,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen, troops as numerous as the sand on the seashore. So, first of all, you see that the Israelites are outnumbered, but they're also outgunned. Now remember, this time that we're talking about 1100 BC, is right on the cusp between the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. The Israelites were still back here in the Bronze Age, and we're going to see that more toward the end of the chapter, but the Philistines had made the leap into the Iron Age, okay? And one of the things they had was chariots. Israel didn't have those yet. They would under David. They would perfect it under Solomon. But these would be three-man chariots, okay? So why would chariots be so important? Well, it'd be like tanks in modern warfare. A lot of firepower can be delivered to a certain point very quickly. Instead of running by foot, you can get a couple of men in position. By the way, just an interesting side note, our modern tank was first initiated by my friend Winston Churchill during World War I. He's the one who first conceptualized the possibility of tank warfare. And because it was a top secret initiative on a part of the British Empire, he kind of called these new machines, he said, let's call them water tanks, that we're developing a new water tank. And it's from that kind of secret code language that we get our word tank that will come into battle. So same thing, you can deliver firepower and troops very quickly to a particular location, okay, which gives a strategic advantage. So they had 3,000 chariots. So this is verse 6, and here's the test of leadership. The men of Israel saw that they were in trouble, and that Hebrew word in trouble, that it literally means it was narrow for him. And we say the same thing. We get into trouble means we get into a tight spot. So it was tight for him. He was in a tight spot because the troops were in a difficult situation. They hid in caves, thickets, among rocks, and holes and cisterns. Some Hebrews even crossed the Jordan. They were fleeing to Gad and to Gilead. So here you have troop morale is at an all-time low, okay? Philistines are coming, okay? We brought this on ourselves, but now we're a little bit overwhelmed. Saul, however, was still at Gilgal, and all of his troops were gripped with fear. So verse 8, here's the challenge. So he waited 7 days for the appointed time that Samuel had set. But Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and Saul's troops were deserting him. So what's happening here? So there's a couple things. We need to kind of fill in the blanks here and some possibilities. So it seemed that whenever there was a national crisis that Saul would deal with from a military standpoint, Samuel would also show up and kind of bring a spiritual perspective on the moment and give some spiritual guidance. Should we attack or not? And it seems to be going all the way back to chapter 10. It seems to be that whenever there was a crisis, whenever there was a challenge of leadership, whenever Saul needed something, that he could probably send a message to Samuel, or other people would tell Samuel, and within 7 days, Samuel would show up. All right. So that just kind of seemed to be their relationship. Whenever there's a problem, Saul would begin making plans. Samuel would show up. He would lend his spiritual perspective to the immediate problem, and then Saul would act. But on this occasion, Samuel doesn't show up. Okay, he's not there, and this is getting pretty dire. But Samuel didn't come to Gilgal, and the troops were deserting Saul. So Saul said, and here's what Samuel would have done had he shown up. But Saul said, "Bring me the burnt offering and the fellowship offerings." Then he offered the burnt offering. So two things would happen spiritually. There would be, as a part of seeking God's favor, there'd be a burnt offering and a fellowship offering. Now what happens is Saul's in the middle of this. He offers the burnt offering. And wouldn't you know, right when he's in the middle, right when his hand's in the cookie jar, here's where Samuel shows up. Just as he finished offering the burnt offering, hadn't done the fellowship offering yet, Samuel arrived. So Saul went out to greet him as though nothing was wrong. "Hey, Sam, what's going on?" Samuel said, "What have you done?" Okay, so here we're going to dig into one of the trickiest scenes in Saul's life, that obviously he does something here that is so egregious, it is so bad. It wouldn't cost him his kingship. He would still be king, if my timeline is right, for another 20 years. But it would cost him a dynasty. So instead of his son, Jonathan, being king, now God would go out and choose another king and create a dynasty through that person, and we know that person to be David. So this cost him his future. The way he acted in the present negatively affected his future. Don't we all need to to learn some of these lessons? Okay, so this in my opinion is pretty good, especially for those who hit midlife and want to coast just a bit. So Saul tried to explain himself. Saul answered, and this is the middle of verse 11. Saul answered, "When I saw the troops were deserting me, and you didn't come within the appointed days, and the Philistines were gathering at Michmash, I thought, the Philistines will now descend on me at Gilgal, and I haven't sought the Lord's favor. So I forced myself to offer the burnt offerings." So everything Saul says is absolutely the truth. I mean, he has his legitimate reasons for what he did. The troops were scattering. Samuel had not come, either when he said he would come or when tradition dictated that he would come. The Philistines were gathering. He needed to have God's favor before going into battle. In other words, Saul acted according to his observation and not according to obedience. Don't we make the same mistake all the time? Saul acted according to what he saw and what he felt was right, rather than what he knew God had commanded him to do. We all do this. We all, base our obedience by what we see. And really what we need to do is not just look at the outward evidence, but say, what does God call me to do, regardless of how situations change? This also brings into question that old adage, and I've heeded this from time to time. It's better to do something wrong than not to do something at all. I'd rather do something and make a mistake than just sit back and wait around. So maybe there's a time that we do that. Maybe there's times we try different things. But this is one of those times when God's been clear. It's better to do nothing and just wait. So this was Saul's leadership test, that test of waiting and patience, to do the right thing at the right time for the right reasons, and not, not to act in haste. So Samuel said to Saul, "You have been foolish." Now here's where I want to try to understand, what is it that Saul does that's so sinful here, that's so bad? And there's a couple of options. First, it could have been that Saul was insensitive to spiritual issues. Excuse me, I'm recording this early in the morning and I'm still having a little trouble today. That Saul was insensitive to spiritual issues. In other words, he is ignorant. Like, Doesn't matter if Samuel's here or not. I can do the offerings, right? And so really he was just wanting to get it over with so he could get God's blessing, so he could go fight the battle, which was in his wheelhouse, right? So maybe he was insensitive to the spiritual importance of what Samuel did, or he was being out and out rebellious. Well, that son of a gun Samuel isn't here when he said he would be here. I'll just do it myself. And so there's that sense of rebellion. So was Saul ignorant? Should he have known better? Was Saul being rebellious? Should he have acted differently? We don't know. We can't step into Saul's mind, and we aren't told from the scripture what his motive was. But whatever it was, and in my Wednesday night class, we'll kind of maybe take a vote on what all that was. But Samuel's indictment is, you were foolish. You have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. It was at this time that the Lord would have permanently, and I'm in verse 13, would have established your reign over Israel. But now your reign will not endure. So Samuel is using dynastic language here. You could have been a dynasty. God could have established you, caused your throne to endure. But because you couldn't wait on God, because you judged by what you saw rather than what you knew what was right, your dynasty will no longer endure. The Lord has found, and here's the first hint that we hear of David in verse 14. The Lord has found a man after his own heart, and the Lord has appointed him as ruler over his people. This language is, it's already happened. God's already moved on from you. Now, this didn't mean that Saul was no longer king. He was king, and God would still use him in the interim. But God had other plans for the future, because you have not done what the Lord has commanded. Verse 15, then Samuel went from Gilgal to Gibeah and Benjamin. Saul registered the troops who were with him at about 600 men. So his troops are diminishing. Many of them have fled. But here you see a break, because Samuel leaves. You see this break between Samuel and Saul that is never really mended. And there'll be another event that will finally tear their relationship beyond any reconciliation. But geographically, just their physical movements represent what's happening emotionally between the two. That they're disconnected, they're now moving in different directions. Verse 16, Saul, his son Jonathan, and the troops that were with him were staying at Geba of Benjamin, and the Philistines were camped at Michmash. Now, here's where I'm just going to do a quick geography lesson. These two places, Geba and Michmash, Geba would be on the Israelite side, Michmash would be on the Philistine side. These two places were only 2 miles apart, but between the two is a deep ravine, and you can still go there today and see this ravine. Now, that would come to play in the next chapter, setting up Jonathan's victory on what he would do. So there's this deep ravine between the two. So they're kind of facing off, kind of taunting one another. Raiding parties, the root word there for raiding parties just means destruction. So destructive parties went out from the Philistine camp. They were just wreaking confusion and havoc. Okay, one division headed toward the Orpha Road, leading to the land of Shual. The next division headed toward Beth Horon Road. The last division headed down to the border road that overlooks the Zebulun Valley toward the wilderness. So here you get this picture of the Philistines are just about this guerrilla warfare, and it's creating anxiety and confusion. And for Jonathan and Saul, do they go and fight these raiding parties, or do they stand off in front of the main military? This is just a bad situation, got a whole lot worse. And not only is Saul now fighting the Philistines, he's fighting his own doubt of his own leadership. That now the dynasty has been taken away from me. Whether he fully understood that or not, we don't know. So now, verse 19 and the last paragraph here. Again, I love this kind of historical footnote. In fact, if we were to write a modern book, we would just footnote this, but it's in the main text of the scripture. The writer wants to draw a picture of how hopeless the situation was and how unlikely it was that Saul and Jonathan would prevail. But isn't it interesting that even though God's blessing had left Saul the blessing of a dynasty, God was still going to use him. So I wanted to set up how impossible this victory looked, all right? No blacksmith could be found in all the land of Israel. Why? They were still in the Bronze Age. They hadn't come up to speed with the Philistines. Okay, the Philistines were now in the Iron Age. They were using new tools that were better because the Philistines said otherwise. The Hebrews will make swords and spears. So part of their lack of technology was they were not sharing their military intelligence. They weren't sharing their technology with the Hebrews. Why would you share your intelligence with the enemy, right? So all the Israelites, this is not a military function, this is a farming function. So all the Israelites went to the Philistines to sharpen their plows and their mattocks and their axes and their sickles. The price was 2/3 of a shekel. Now, as a coin collector, I stop here and I look at this. They didn't use coins yet, all right? Coins would not come along until 6th century Greece, 5th or 6th century Greece. But they took silver and the weight was a shekel. So this was a certain weight of silver, and 2/3 a shekel. That was just a high price. That was a high price to sharpen blades that would be used for farming. So you get the picture that these troops, they couldn't sharpen their own weapons, and that's all they had to fight with were their farming implements. The price was 2/3 of a shekel for the plows and the mattocks, and 1/3 a shekel for the pitchforks and the axes, and for putting a point on a cattle prod. So, on the day of battle, not a sword or spear could be found in any of the hands who were of the troops that were with Saul and Jonathan. Only Saul and his son Jonathan had weapons. So you see how impossible the challenge is here now ahead of them to defeat the Philistines with superior forces, superior firepower. So I want to do a walk-away application on this because I think it's important, because this is what caused Saul, his mistake in the present moment caused him, or cost him, his future. And it was because he would not wait on God. Now, I don't know the exact science. I don't know the exact art of when we act and when we wait. I do know this, that we need to go when we're trying to figure out what obedience looks like in the moment. We need to stick with the last thing God told us. Stick with that, okay? Even though circumstances change, stick with the last thing you heard from God. Then when God tells you the next thing, that's the moment. You've waited up until that moment. And when God speaks next, that's when you act. And I think that's a good general principle. You always want to go with the last thing you heard from God. Even though your outside circumstances change, stick with that obedience until God speaks again. And then you take the next step. And that lack of the ability to wait is what would cost Saul his kingdom and would begin to cause his mental faculties to unravel. And we're going to see him now here for the rest of his life, really kind of wandering. He's reacting. He's not acting clearly. There's probably some mental illness that sets in. And even to his final act, he comes back to, and this is what's interesting, when you get to chapter 28, Saul comes back to Samuel. After Samuel's dead, he tries to conjure up a dead spirit, seeking guidance. Would that Saul would have done that here. And it seems that for the rest of his life, Saul lacks guidance because of this. There is no guidance for the self-willed. There is no guidance for the self-willed. If we're going to do it our way anyway, God's not going to bother. But if we're willing, regardless of the circumstances, to obey whatever God tells us, then God gives his guidance to those whose wills already belong to him. So that's 1 Samuel chapter 13. We will be meeting next week. We're going to jump into 1 Samuel 14 and look at Jonathan, kind of save the day against all odds. It's a fantastic engagement of battle that we'll see. So that'll be next week. And I will tell you the week of Thanksgiving, which this is airing on Thursday night. So that week of Thanksgiving, we will not have an online course that night. Then we're going to come back after Thanksgiving and kind of wrap up with 2 more weeks. But that's 1 Samuel 13. Want to let you know, remember, We're downtown every Wednesday night in person. Right now in my class, there's about 25 or so folks, so there's still plenty of room for social distancing in the classroom on the 4th floor of our children's building and our adult conference center. So blessings on you. Have a great week, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.